Welcome to week 3, and in week 3 we're going to talk about sediments, sedimentary rocks, and metamorphic rocks. This is video 1, and we are going to talk about sediments specifically in this video. So we'll talk about what sediments are, some of the major types that exist, and then how those sediments form through the process of weathering. So what are sediments? Sediments are basically material that's broken down from rocks through the process of weathering, and these sediments are usually transported from one place to another through wind, rain, water, ice, things like that. So the major types of sediments, we have 3 categories: detrital, chemical, and biologic. Detrital sediments are made up of just chunks of other rocks or chunks of minerals, and I have 2 examples on this side of the screen here. We've got one that has some gravel bits with some sand, and then some just plain sand fragments. Biological sediments are in the middle here. These sediments have something to do with life. So usually you'll see signs of life in those sediments. So things like fragments of shells, things like that. Chemical sediments are going to be those that are produced through some sort of chemical reaction, and in this photograph what you can see are chunks of halite, salt, and how this forms is it's actually precipitated out of salt water. As the water is evaporated out, salts are left behind, and then we get these crystals starting to form as the concentration of salt increases in the water and no longer can be dissolved in the water. It has to actually form into a solid. So detrital, bits of rock fragments; chemical, some kind of chemical reaction; biologic, there's some type of organism helping to create that sediment. And these sediments can be a variety of different sizes. Here we've got 2 main sizes. We've got sand here with these 2 bottom images, and then gravel sized, maybe about 1 centimeter or 2 in size. There's some gravel bits in this one. You can have larger ones that are cobble sized, maybe about the size of your fist. Boulder would be huge, maybe the size of a car, quite large, something you wouldn't be able to actually pick up. And then the smallest size would be mud or clay, and this is a size that you can't actually see the particles with the naked eye. It's so fine-grained. So next question is, we get these sediments that are weathered, and I mentioned they're transported and brought to a different location. Well, we call this erosion, where material is removed. Like this example here, you can see this cliff on the stream bank where this sediment is being removed from one side of the river. So it's moved away from that location, and then it's deposited someplace else. And here you can see where some of that sediment is deposited on the inside of that river bend. So all of the sediment, once it's weathered and broken down from the original rock material, it's going to be transported, eroded, transported, and then deposited someplace else. So how does that material weather? How does it break down? Well, there's basically 2 main types. There's chemical and physical weathering, and this basically breaks rocks into smaller particles or into chemical solutions. So chemical weathering has some kind of chemical reaction to break the rocks down, so it's like dissolving a rock or rusting or oxidizing a rock. And then physical weathering is merely just the physical breakdown of the rock, so it actually just breaks into smaller and smaller pieces. There is no change in the chemistry. So we'll talk a little more detail on the different types of weathering here, and then we'll talk about the relationship between climate and weathering. So chemical weathering, this is where we have some kind of chemical reaction taking place to break that rock into smaller and smaller bits, into actual ions and dissolved substances. So we have what's called dissolution, which is the breaking apart of molecules in water or some kind of aqueous solution. And these are usually ionic bonds that are breaking apart. So an example would be salt, this chemical formula we see down here. We've got halite, which we used in lab a couple weeks ago. combining with water. You can do this at home with table salt if you have a sore throat. A lot of people do this to try to get rid of it. And as you dissolve that salt in the water molecule helps to break apart this ionic bond and pull the sodium away from the chlorine ion, and then we have these two ions dissolved in the water. This can also happen through carbonic acid, can also dissolve rocks away, and we'll talk more about that process when we talk about groundwater. Oxidation, this is where we have a positive ion. So for example here we've got an example of iron combining with oxygen. So we have this iron positive ion combining with oxygen, and then we get rust forming, or hematite. Another example, you can see the Statue of Liberty here. This is copper, and copper is going to start to oxidize and give you that greenish color. The last type is what's called hydrolysis. This is where water combines into the mineral structure. We actually end up getting things rearranging, incorporating that water, and we get clays as a result. So when we start talking about clay sediments, this is where they come from this process of hydrolysis. So then we want to talk about physical weathering, so the actual physical breakdown of rocks into smaller and smaller particles. There's three main types we'll talk about in this class. We've got frost, wedging, expansion, and abrasion. Frost wedging occurs anywhere where temperatures fluctuate back and forth between freezing and thawing. So maybe up on Mount Hood would be a good example. Some parts of the gorge would be an example. What happens, and here is an example of a rock that has some cracks in it up on Mount Hood. And you can see some particles that have broken off here. Well, what happens is water seeps into those cracks, freezes, and when water freezes, it expands. So it actually helps to fracture and break that rock apart as it freezes. And then chunks get broken off and then fall to the ground around it. And this can happen also down here in Yosemite, anywhere where you have temperatures that fluctuate on a daily basis back and forth between hot and cold, freezing and thawing. This next one called expansion. We have expansion happening through thermal expansion and unweighting. So in deserts, this example here, this is from a desert in Texas, down in Big Bend National Park. We're down the Texas-Mexico border. And what happens there is the temperature can fluctuate from maybe around 40 or 50 at night to in the 90s or 100s during the day. And what happens is those minerals in the rock are going to be responding to that temperature change. And when temperature increases, these minerals, some of them start to expand. When the temperature decreases, they tend to contract. And as that expanding and contracting happens, we get this kind of flaking off of the outer layers of that rock. So we can see some bits and pieces that are on the ground around this rock. So this is just kind of flaking off the surface. A larger scale version of this you can see in Yosemite National Park, where this whole entire park, basically the Sierra Nevada mountains, were once deep inside the earth. This is an intrusive igneous rock, a big pluton that was once buried underneath miles and miles of rock that is now exposed at the surface. So all that rock above is removed, and that pluton that was once under intense pressure is now exposed to the surface. That pressure has been released, so that rock is going to expand upwards and outwards, and we end up with huge blocks just breaking off, kind of like peeling of an onion skin. So very, very similar process as thermal and the unweighting. Abrasion, wind, water, and ice. I have two examples here of abrasion from ice. Here we can see a nice smooth surface that was created as ice kind of rode over with tiny particles in it, sanding it down. And here we can see a big chunk of rock that slid across the surface here and chipped away at that bedrock. And that rock that would have chipped away at this bedrock would have been stuck in the ice. So we have ice moving particles back and forth. We have water that can transport sands, gravels, and scratch along the bottom of the river channel. And then wind can actually pick up smaller particles and basically sandblast the surrounding material. So wide variety of types of weathering. So some of the factors that affect weathering, climate is by far the biggest. So anywhere where we have a wet climate, we can have more chemical weathering. So we have dissolution that can happen and hydrolysis that can happen. If we have warmer climates, the warmer temperatures, we actually have quicker weathering because the bonds in those minerals are easier to break. And then if it's cool and dry, it's pretty slow weathering. And this is because we have cooler temperatures, so bonds aren't as easy to break, and there isn't any water present, so we don't have the hydrolysis or the dissolution or that water present to help with the freezing and thawing and breaking the rocks apart. So overall, warm, wet climates like the tropics are going to be places where weathering happens the fastest. Also, we can have organisms like plants that live and die. They can produce some acids to break things down. Animals burrowing around in the sediments can help churn things up. And then time. The longer a rock is exposed, the more weathering is going to occur. And here I've got two examples of our neck of the woods where we have pretty wet climate. We do fluctuate seasonally through warm and wet climates, warm and dry climates. So we have kind of we're in the middle of the road here as far as weathering is concerned. And then here, if you were to go out into eastern Oregon, this is an example from Death Valley, but eastern Oregon, southeastern Oregon is a pretty dry climate. It's warm, it can fluctuate in the wintertime between freezing and thawing, but there isn't a whole lot of water. So we see features like this where we get dry riverbeds most of the year except for maybe in the spring. So overall, warm, wet are going to be the climates that are going to produce the most amount of weathering. So that's sediments, how they're produced and how weathering occurs. We'll come back in the next video and talk about sedimentary rocks.